Okay, welcome everyone. I've just resumed recording this session. You are signed into the Crew DC program on ESG+R in action. This is our part 2 of our 3-part series, and today we're going to talk about motivators. My name is Kathy Alger. I'm the executive director for Crew DC. I'll be working behind the scenes today to make sure that things go smoothly. You guys are all pros on working with Zoom now. You don't need any explanation. We'll keep you on mute, except when you're asking questions. We want you to use the chat to post a question at any time during the presentation, and we will bring it up during the presentation and or save it to the end, depending on sort of how it fits into the flow of our presenters today. I want to give a big thank you to our committee members and to our speakers today who put this program together. It's very timely and topical, which is the kind of stuff that we like to talk about. And I also want to say thank you to our corporate sponsors. Crew DC has just about wrapped up its sponsorship campaign, and we have had a wonderful year thanks to the diligent efforts of a lot of our members and many returning sponsors. We have more than 80 companies, local companies, national, global companies supporting the organization this year. And for that, we are very grateful. It helps us do what we do. And so without further ado, then I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to introduce you to Cecilia Kane from Colliers, and she is one of the committee members who has helped put this program together, and she's going to introduce our speakers and help manage Q&A during the session. So Cecilia, over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. Welcome, everybody. This morning, we are joined by Jessica Long and Kendra Wiley, who I'm pleased to introduce. As the head of sustainability for Nuveen's real estate US portfolio, Jessica is responsible for the implementation of the firm's Tomorrow's World Sustainability Platform, focusing on incorporating climate risk in the investment process, meeting energy and carbon reduction targets for the US real estate portfolio, and communicating ESG strategy to investors. And she will help us provide an institutional owner perspective for this morning's discussion. And along with Jessica, we have Kendra Wiley as the Legislative Director of DC's Department of Energy and Environment. To achieve the city's carbon neutrality goals, Kendra creates policy and programming for clean energy initiatives, including net zero energy and carbon in new and existing buildings, transportation electrification, and actions in the Clean Energy DC plan. And she will provide us with an environmental regulation and consultant perspective. So as Kathy mentioned, feel free to interject with questions in the Q&A or let me know if you'd like to be unmuted to ask it aloud, but we'll also have a designated time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to save it for that part. So with that, I'll pass it over to our panelists to kick off the discussion this morning.
Thank you, Cecilia. Good morning, everyone. So we prepared some topics and questions to talk to you today. This is the second of a 4-part series. And so the first part sort of set the stage and then defined what environmental, social governance, and resilience and health is, and had some discussions about some example projects. And so we're here today to talk about the motivators for environmental, social governance and thinking about the built environment in a climate change context. And so we'll start first with Jessica and sort of setting the scene and talking about the motivators that are in play from her perspective and the perspective that she holds within the industry, and to get us started here today. Jessica?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Happy to be here with everyone today. So as was introduced, I'm the head of sustainability for Nuveen Real Estate. Nuveen is the asset manager for TIAA and third-party institutional clients from around the globe. We manage $142 billion in real estate assets, which includes both debt and equity investments. And in addition to that, within the equity portfolio, we have wholly owned properties, which we are responsible for the asset management. And then we have JV partners, where we are more of a silent partner, and our partner is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the building. So that obviously will come into play as you think about all the different ways that the topics that we talk about around ESG, how they have to be implemented in different ways for different vehicles of investment. Our teams are set up in sector teams. So we have investment teams and portfolio managers across office, retail, multifamily, industrial, and then several of what we call alternative sectors, such as life science, single family rentals, self-storage, kind of those alternatives to those main core sectors. And then debt as well, as I mentioned, debt investments is kind of their own investment team. The history of our sustainability program has been focused mainly on equity investments, but recently, the acceleration and focus in ESG, there's been commitments across our entire firm. So not just real estate, public equities, fixed income, real assets, which includes infrastructure, timber, and farmland. We have commitments to responsible investing and ESG integration across all of those sectors. The good news is that real estate's really been out ahead of this for many years. And so I've been focused on sustainability for, I have to look at the date sometimes, over 12 years within the real estate sector, working on sustainability. And it's really, like I said, kind of coming across the board, across all investment asset classes. And for my team, it now kind of includes debt. And so you're seeing more and more where you're going to hear questions from your lender about sustainability certifications or sustainability programs. And we're doing this ourselves, and we're also seeing this come in from lenders. And so kind of getting into a little bit more of those motivators, right? It's really that top-down motivation where our investors are really getting more aggressive and wanting to understand how ESG has been integrated into our investment process. So we get, long DDQs that we have to fill out, where we have to describe our investment process, and then we're expected to report regularly on the progress and what we're doing specifically within our portfolio around ESG. And I'll talk a little bit more as we move through the discussion about really how we demonstrate leadership through things like the annual GRESB assessment. But that's something that, again, our investors are definitely it used to be just, okay, we just want you to submit, and now it's, we want you to reach a certain level of performance. And so I said that the needle's really moving quickly as far as what the expectations are. The other key motivator that I wanted to touch on from that top-down perspective is regulation. So we in the real estate community think about regulation a lot as far as the regulation that's happening at the building level. And I know Kendra is going to talk about what DC is doing and similar legislation across the country. But what I've actually been most focused on recently is regulation of financial services. And so this is about requirements for disclosure to investors about ESG. And so there are new regulations that have come out in the past year and a half, or actually about exactly a year since they've come into effect in Europe, called the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And that is a regulation that's really aimed at combating greenwashing in the market. So if you say that sustainability is part of your investment process, then you really have to be able to demonstrate how that's influencing your investment decisions and what are the metrics and targets that are associated with ESG in your investment portfolio. And again, that's across all asset classes, not just real estate. Similar legislation in the US is expected from the SEC later this year. There already is a lot of recommendations, I'm probably not using the right word there, from the SEC on how to talk about climate risk specifically, but also just generally around kind of, do what you say and say what you do when it comes to investor disclosures about ESG. But as I mentioned, the SEC is coming out with more formal requirements for how financial services companies, and in all companies, actually publicly traded companies especially, need to disclose risks associated with climate change. So this is a really big focus for our team, because we have clients from around the world, so we have to worry about legislation in Europe. And then we're obviously an American company, so we are focused on what's happening here as well. So from the top down perspective, I think those are the key drivers. And I know that it's probably like, okay, yeah, we've been hearing about this forever. What's changed now? And I really do think that with the focus on climate, the commitments that have come about since the 2015 Paris Accords, that really now countries and jurisdictions like DC have committed to targets that align with that 1.5 degree scenario of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. You're now seeing that things are picking up, because companies that operate within those jurisdictions have to really understand how those rules are going to impact their day-to-day business. And so it's trickling down from the top. And then I think it's also bubbling up with companies that are commercial tenants having to kind of pay attention to this as well. And everybody really thinking about the big picture and how this impacts them. And so climate risk is the big one, but then I don't want to lose sight of other ESG related issues like diversity and inclusion, health and wellness, some of the things that are really have taken a center stage over the past couple years that also fall into that, ESG and sustainability for real estate focus, where we're getting more questions from clients, we're getting more requirements for disclosure around these areas. And so we really have to not only be doing it, but we have to have an organized way of being able to track, monitor, and document improvements in metrics across all areas of ESG. So I'm going to pause here. That's kind of my big picture, top-down motivators, and let Kendra kind of take over from there.
Thank you, Jessica. And so from my perspective, as Cecilia mentioned, I'm the legislative director here at Washington, D.C.'s Department of Energy and Environment. So working on the city level, tracking what's happening from a national and a global perspective. And so our Building Energy Performance Standard passed as part of our Clean Energy Omnibus Act. And we have goals to be carbon neutral. We have goals to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2032. And then we have a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. And the question is, how do we get there? What are the actual actions that need to be taken? And so we've created our Sustainable DC 2.0 plan. We've created our Climate Ready DC plan, which talks about climate mitigation and adaptation in the city. We have flooding, it gets very hot, climate change is real. And then we have our Clean Energy DC Act and our Clean Energy DC plan. And so with that, our Building Energy Performance Standard says if you're not performing at or above the median for your property type, you have to make changes over the next 5 years. So in DC, it started in 2021, and we've allowed for an extra year for properties to comply because of COVID. And so it starts at 50,000 square feet and then ratchets down to 25,000 square feet and then 10,000 square feet. And so as we thought about creating our Building Energy Performance Standard, or BEPS, one of the things that we looked a lot at was the fact that buildings have been benchmarking for over a decade. And so you can't fix what you don't measure. So we measured for a while and then put the Energy Performance Standard in place. And so just to give some context on that, we published the numbers for different property types, and it's based on the Energy Star score. And Energy Star, as most of you are probably familiar with, is a system hosted by the federal government online for free, where you report your energy usage. So for office, the score is 71, and the score goes from 0 to 100. And for retail and stores, that score is 64. And so we used building energy performance data in 2019 to come up with these medians that people have to meet. So it's not a median of 50, it's a median of the peers of your property type. It's not fair to compare an office to a residential building because the use types are different. Residential buildings obviously consume more energy at night, for example, with residents being at home. So because they have different use types, each property type gets its own category. For properties that don't actually get an Energy Star score, we've created what's called, or we didn't create, but we're measuring it by the EUI, or the energy usage intensity. And so looking across the nation, New York has its local law 97, which was mentioned in the last discussion about how they're going to be letter grades actually on the building. So when you walk in your building, you'll see this building is performing at an A, B, C, D, et cetera. The state of California is also requiring benchmarking. Some other cities that are looking at either benchmarking and or building energy performance standards are places like Salt Lake City, Utah, Denver, Austin, some smaller places like Minneapolis, Orlando, Atlanta, and then our neighbors in Montgomery County are actually similarly working on a building energy performance standard. And so when we talk about carbon reduction, that's one of the ways that we're tackling it. And then also from a resiliency perspective, thinking where are there opportunities to add solar? Is that something that buildings and cities and states want to start doing either on a voluntary basis or something that's going to be acquired? So a lot of you may be familiar with the LEED building performance certification. So we're starting to move towards, well, with LEED, it's like, okay, fill out a lot of paperwork, you do some energy retro commissioning, but now we're starting to get into the actual performance of the building. Is the building actually performing as it should? And that is the wave of the future, is performance. And as a last thing I'll mention, Washington, D.C. City Council late last year, early this year, introduced a bill for new construction to be net zero energy. And so that's something that we're tracking here at DOE, and to make sure that we can start to move in a direction that's going to be meaningful. And so as we move forward with our conversation, Jessica, I'll pass it back to you for you to discuss some of the strategies that you're using, some targets that y'all are looking at, and potentially KPIs and the types of reporting that you have to dig into when you do this work.
Yeah, thank you. And just to kind of start it out and connect the conversation a little bit, one of the key metrics that we're tracking is exposure to regulation. And so all of the locations that Kendra was mentioning, not only do we need to know that they have a regulation, what is the standard in that location? So, the local law 97 and Boston have carbon standards. DC and state of Washington and I think St. Louis have adopted energy intensity standards. And then, like Kendra was saying, across all the different sectors, there's a different target that you're trying to reach. And so we're developing dashboards just to tell us, does this location, if we own a building in a location, is benchmarking required? Are there other prescriptive things like the letter grades or requirements for energy audits? And then performance against that benchmark, that performance benchmark, are we above or below? Are we expected to be above or below in the future based on the business plan that we have in place? Really focusing in on those metrics and targets. And I couldn't agree more with the statement that, LEED has benefits, and it's definitely kind of helped move the conversation along over the years. But you could have a LEED certified building that is below the median energy use for the sector that needs to comply and bring that energy use down and improvement to the efficiency. So that performance-based solution is so key. And so just thinking about that, there's two main things that I was going to talk about, and I might start with net zero carbon because it was just mentioned, and it really ties closely to what I was just saying about those measuring that EUI standard. So for us, we've set a net zero carbon target by 2040. So to have our entire real estate portfolio, including debt and equity, net zero carbon by 2040. And that was intentionally set 10 years ahead of the 2050 date, which is the date where it's assumed that all buildings need to be net zero carbon if we're going to meet that goal of 1.5, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so we really think that by, trying to get our entire portfolio net zero by 2040, we're mitigating that risk associated with those last 10 years where buildings might start to lose value. And I think much sooner in some locations, but definitely in that last decade, that if you don't have a plan in place to get a building to net zero, you're really at risk of that asset becoming obsolete. The key thing that I think as an industry we're still struggling with, and especially here in the US, is what is that standard? And so what does it mean to be a net zero carbon building? We need to define net zero carbon so that I can say, yes, we've done it on this portfolio, or when I'm looking at a new acquisition, I can say, okay, yes, that fits into our net zero portfolio, or these are the things that need to be done to get it there. And so one of the key things that I wanted to talk a little bit about is some of the, our definition of net zero, and then some of the frameworks that are out there that are being used to measure performance of real estate assets. And so our definition is pretty simple. A building should only use its fair share of energy, and that's a kind of ambiguous statement, but I'll talk a little bit more about it. So use its fair share of available renewable energy, get all energy from a renewable source, both on and off site, and eliminate or have a plan to phase out the use of on-site fossil fuels. The other key thing that I don't know if we're going to talk a lot about today, but I think it's worth noting is reduction in embodied carbon, and looking to reduce the embodied carbon associated with development and construction activities. All of that kind of packaged up into what we say are the things that we need to focus on in order to bring our portfolio to net zero. So the idea that a carbon commitment is tied to an energy efficiency target or improvement, that's something that I think that I still hear some debate about, but I think it's really important, right? It's not feasible or reasonable to think that, okay, we can just go out and buy renewable energy and use as much energy as we want. We really need to understand what's a reasonable amount of renewable energy that we think will be available as we move along towards a net zero carbon world. And then how do we carve up that energy use across all sectors of the economy to make sure that we can now understand, okay, well, this is what my fair share is. If I'm a multifamily building owner or an office building owner, what is that amount of energy that I should be using to play my part in that transition to net zero? So in Europe, they've developed a framework called the CREM pathways. And they've recently published US pathways. It's available in limited markets across the US. But basically what it does is kind of put some science to those, that concept that I was just describing, in mapping out sector by sector in different regions of the country, how much a downward trajectory to net zero in 2050 of how much energy a building should use to be aligned with the 1.5 degree scenario. I definitely think there's a lot of work to be done to perfect that framework for the US. But the reason I bring it up is because it is being used in by European investors that are mapping our portfolio against the framework, whether we agree or not. And it's also been adopted by GRESB. And so the other kind of key metric that I wanted to talk about is GRESB as the ESG benchmark for real estate. And so GRESB is now moving towards using CREM pathways to compare a portfolio against a 1.5 degree scenario. And so as that comes into play between now and 2025, again, any buildings that are held by a public REIT or in a fund, a private fund with European investors or investors that are requiring GRESB, you're gonna see that CREM alignment being really important metric to understand and to follow. And I see that some of the links that Kathy's putting in can give more detail on this. Thank you, Kathy. So I'll just touch quickly on GRESB. This is a key metric. This is a assessment of ESG performance at the fund level. And so a private fund or a public REIT would submit annually to the GRESB assessment and get a rating of 1 through 5 stars that would basically say if you're in the top 20% of scores globally, you get 5 stars, and bottom 20% of funds globally would get 1 star. And this is a measure of management and policy around ESG and then performance. And it's more heavily weighted towards performance. So data coverage, year over year, improvements of energy, greenhouse gas, water, waste metrics are being scored, as well as things like tenant engagement and community engagement and diversity and inclusion. And so all of the elements of ESG, this is really a rating of how a real estate manager is handling ESG within their investment portfolio. And so as I was mentioning at the beginning, this is something that we submit to annually. We have over 10 funds in the US, I think 20 funds globally that submit across our portfolio. That's growing every year with new funds coming in. And it's one of the key things that our investors are asking about. What's your score? What's your plan to improve your score? What are all the things that you're doing to demonstrate leadership in ESG within this portfolio? And so I think it's an important thing for everybody within the real estate community to understand, because it really goes, it goes top of the house to, the highest, how are you managing, is the board responsible for ESG, all the way down to, are you tracking waste on your construction projects? And so it's really just soup to nuts, a lot of information that my team, is really focused on gathering across, as I mentioned, right, all of our property management firms, JV partners, development projects, all of the information about what's going on at individual buildings being aggregated and submitted once a year into this assessment. And so we're in the middle of that time frame right now, and it's a key focus for our team. So I'll pause there, stop.
Thank you, Jessica. So to add on a little bit to what she mentioned in terms of fair share, that's one of the things that we look at a lot here in DC is you can't just put solar on a building and then say your building is performing well. So one of the things that we try to encourage people and properties to do is to pursue energy efficiency measures, get down your energy use as much as possible, and then add renewables. And so when she said fair share, it made me think of the American Geophysical Union that we have here in Washington, D.C., which is a net zero energy building that has solar as well. One of the things that they do over at that building is they have their plug loads will shut off when you've reached your maximum energy use capacity. So when we talk about fair share, there's a usage case for it too, to say, for people to understand, you shouldn't just use as much as possible. How can you be efficient and responsible for the energy that you are using? Another thing I'll mention in terms of regulations is thinking about solar requirements. And so here in the district, we have a renewable portfolio standard where we're trying to clean up and modernize our grid. And with that, we have what's called a solar carve out, which means we want 10% of the clean energy that's produced in the district to come from solar generated sources. And so I'll also mention that New York has local law 92 and 94 which requires new buildings and existing buildings that are undergoing major renovations to have a solar system, a green roof system, or a combination of the two. And then here in Washington, D.C., we have what's called our green area ratio, which is a similar requirement. And so when we talk about renewable energy and things like that, we're also here in D.C. and in other places thinking about resiliency. And so in DC, we have stormwater retention requirements. And with that green area ratio, it means that a certain part of your roof has to retain stormwater. So that can be through vegetation like grass or trees or bushes. And then we also say you can put solar on top of that green roof. And so there's a lot of different things that are at play. And we know that there's a lot that's being thrown at y'all in your different jobs. And there are resources out there that sort of bring all these things together to help you track things based on where your work is based. And then the other thing I'll mention is there's a lot of places that have different requirements, and then there's different systems in place to help you meet those requirements. So for example, there are what's called a passive house certification, where buildings can start to look at how can I look at incorporating things that are going to have my building use less energy. Do I have operable windows so that when the weather's nice, I can open the windows? I know that's not possible with all buildings, but harnessing things like that. And so to keep moving us along, because I see Wendy's giving us a time warning here. Jessica, one of the things that we said that we would touch on a little bit is considering our access to resources and the responsibility that we have to our environment while we're making all those changes. What's your perspective on that through your work?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that we really focus on a lot in our investment process, as I mentioned, was climate risk, but it's net zero carbon and it's also physical climate risk. And so as was mentioned, DC has flood risk, heat risk. And what we do is really look at climate data. We've acquired climate data from a provider for across the globe for all of the hazards associated with climate change. So think flood, wildfire, drought, water stress, heat stress, hurricanes and typhoons. And really, Matt, and looked at the data through the end of the century, but we really focus on the next 20 years. If you think about a real estate hold period being about 7 to 10 years that an average commercial owner is owning a building. And so we look at our hold period and then the next buyer's potential hold period to understand what are the potential physical changes that could happen to the environment in the place where the building is located that could impact the way the building is used, the operations of the buildings, the occupants of the buildings, and ultimately the value of the building. So that's a key part of our process. However, we really kind of try and it seems like it feels like a super negative thing that we're always bringing up. And it's definitely, a little bit hard to look at the data and see, what is coming. But it's also something that I think is really important that we tackle head on and focus on resilience. So all of these locations, especially here in the US, we don't see kind of being abandoned by the local jurisdictions. We really want to understand how do we as real estate owners play our part in making the community more resilient to these changes. And so we have a process to identify the potential risks that a location is facing over the next 20 years. And then a list of actions that can be assessed as either already part of the building or that can be added to our own capital plans to make the buildings more resilient. But we also look at the surrounding community. So what is the local jurisdiction doing to deal with this issue? What are the things that we can do to engage the community around this issue and make the buildings more resilient? And again, focus on those occupants, because I think a lot of when we think about these hazards, the building is generally okay. We have insurance. There's a lot of things that kind of mitigate financial risk to the building owner. But it's really kind of how is the tenant's operations going to be impacted? How are the occupants going to be potentially impacted by these changes? And how can we make our buildings really feel like a safe and secure place for the people that are in it? So that's kind of one of the key things that we focus on. And some of the strategies that Kendra mentioned that DC has put in place, like green roofs, those all kind of are part of that list of items that we have when we say that there's specific risks in a community, that these are the things that that we would want to focus on within our business plan.
Thank you, Jessica. And then to talk a little bit more about resiliency, some of the things that we're looking at here in DC is we have, as I mentioned, our Climate Ready DC plan. We have what are called resilience design guidelines that people can use when they're thinking about designing and operating their building. We do a lot of work with grid modernization, and we're starting to think about the role of EV charging. And some people have some concerns that if they install EV charging in their building, is that going to drastically increase their energy use? And we had some discussions about the possibility or the ability when you benchmark your building where you can carve out that energy use from the electric vehicles that are charging. And so one thing that DC City Council did was passed a bill that became law, I believe last year, where 20% of parking spaces in new construction or substantial renovations must have EV ready infrastructure, because it's easier and cheaper to install EV charging if you already have the infrastructure in place. It's harder and more expensive to go back to an existing building and make those types of renovations. So we're trying to do some forward thinking on that. From a resiliency perspective, we're also thinking, can a bus, for example, can an electric bus act as a battery for a building and charge or power a building? And so what we're starting to look at with our grid modernization is, number one, can the grid handle not the plug loads per se, but can the grid handle the additional EV charging? But then if we get into a situation where the power goes down, can cars, buses, different types of vehicles then turn around and push energy into the grid, or can they push energy into a building? And so when the freeze happened in Texas in February 2021, what I tried to tell people is, if you had solar panels and you had a battery and you have an EV and the sun's not shining, you can use the battery that your solar panels have stored. And then once that has depleted, you could also look at using your car to power your home. And so that's what we're looking at trying to do, not just at the residential level, but also at the commercial level, and thinking about microgrids, and can neighborhoods start producing their own power and storing their own power, so that when we talk about resiliency, we're talking about resilient neighborhoods and resilient communities and resilient cities. And then zooming out to figure out, can buildings talk to each other, and how does the Internet of Things come into play in terms of a city then deploying those types of energy sources should we get into a situation where there is some sort of natural disaster. And so at this point, in talking about natural disasters or other types of disasters, we'd be remiss if we didn't sort of touch on how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an example of how ESG+R frameworks play out. And so, sometimes we have natural disasters and sometimes we have human conflict. And so, Jessica, I'll let you start here with kind of touching on where all of this conversation comes into play with current events.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the key things, I think, one of the centers of conversation, I think, has been around the tie between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and gas prices and our dependency on fossil fuels. And so I think that it definitely brings up the bigger picture, especially for those of us that are focused on transitioning to net zero and thinking about, our dependence on fossil fuel is really just exacerbates not only climate challenges, but global conflict as well. And I think it complicates things, right? Because we're sitting here saying, okay, a carbon intensive investment could start to lose value because everybody's trying to get to net zero. And here we are with gas prices skyrocketing because of this crisis that's happening in Europe. So it definitely complicates things from that perspective. And then the other piece that I think that is important to talk about is what we always say, well, what about the S? What about the G? We talk about the E a lot. And this is where the S and the G, I think, come up a lot. We definitely on the G front, understanding tenant exposure is something that we get a lot of questions about. And so one of the things that we've been focused on is, is the tenant exposed to the oil and gas industry? Is there transition risk in the tenants business that could impact their ability to, pay rent and whatnot. And now we're getting that. And similarly, we get a lot of questions about human rights and ethical practices, obviously within our own real estate operations. That's something that we want to look at with all of the vendors that we work with. But now we're getting more and more questions about, what our tenants are exposed to. So now do we have tenants with exposure to Russia investments and whatnot and activities? And so we're seeing more and more focus come into what I'll call kind of, adjacent to our business exposure to situations like human rights and global conflict in Europe.
Thank you, Jessica. And so I'll end it here so that we can allow time for questions and discussion. I see we already have some questions in the chat, so we can start there. And then Cecilia can field more questions or comments if we have them from the audience. So the first one is, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Sherry. Jessica is reflecting institutional real estate investor strategies for combating climate change. I wonder what percentage of total building infrastructure in the US are institutional assets? What type of strategies are available or are being addressed by non-institutional building owners? And then there's a part 2 to that question, but I'll stop there for now.
Mm-hmm. I can kind of take the first part of that. I don't want to misquote the number, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty large amount of buildings are owned by commercial investors. So public REITs, private equity funds that own a majority of the commercial building stock in the country. I think probably when you get into the multifamily side, there's probably some smaller, but again, it's largely a company rather than an individual that is going to own those buildings. But I think the second part of the question is really important. I think the strategies that we talk about, if it's a non-institutionally owned building and especially an owner-occupied building, that's where the returns are there, right? One of the things we struggle with as commercial building owners is a lot of the benefits go to the tenant. And so it's hard for us to justify kind of spending the money on the energy efficiency improvements when the tenant pays the utility bill, or saying that we're going to invest in resilience when it's the tenant's operations that are going to be impacted. And technically we're protected from that through insurance and lease language on, they have to pay their rent whether they can access the building or not, which we saw during COVID being a clear thing that we learned about our leases. And so I think that when it comes to owner occupied, that's where, sky's the limit as far as implementing a lot of these sustainability strategies, because all of the benefits really would then accrue to the occupier. And so I think all of the same things really apply.
Thank you, Jessica. Second part to that question, Also, what input do insurance companies have in different municipalities' resilience regulations and standards? So here I would say, as DC government, we try to engage with the community in different ways. And when we were creating our building energy performance standards, one of the things that we did was we convened a task force, and those meetings were open to the public. And so we had some people that were required to serve on the task force, and the law gave a specific list of people that needed to be included. So someone from the private side, someone representing residential properties, someone that comes from the commercial side. And so now that I think about it, one of the participants that would have been great for that task force was someone from the insurance side. But I will also say that that task force and many other task force and organizations that we participate in, we say this is open to the public for people to participate in. And so people could come to those engagement meetings and sessions to give their input, because we try not to create law and policy in a vacuum. We try to really interact with people that are actually going to be doing the work, to get the feedback and for them to say, okay, if this is what you're thinking about, here's what it's going to actually take. This is how much it's going to cost. What sort of incentive programs are in place for people to help people pay for these things? Or for us, from a messaging and education standpoint, to say, if you make these energy efficiency upgrades, the hope is that you'll be able to save money. But then we also have things like our DC Sustainable Energy Utility. And a few years ago, we stood up our Green Bank, who also offers additional financing. So we try to pair the laws with the financial incentives. I'm going to scroll up a little bit, and I see a question from Wendy Feldman Block. And the question is a question around GRESB ratings versus Morningstar's Sustainalytics. Hard to have an apple to apples comparison between their risk ratings. I look at this through the lens of an advisor to office occupiers who more and more want to know which buildings they are considering to report on ESG. Wendy, if I got that question right. Or would you like to come off mute and expand upon your comment or question?
Sure. I hope it makes sense. What I'm struggling with is we're being asked this more and more, Kendra. And so if you get, for example, I'll simplify it. If you look up on Sustainalytics, which has been a great one I go to, they say that, for example, Boston Properties has a risk rating of 13.9. You want the lowest. You look at GRESB for someone like Oxford, who's not in the US, and they tell me that their rating is 92. So they're happy that they have a high score. And I know that from school, like we always want the highest grade, but the Sustainalytics is you want to be the lowest you can be. Who's helping understand that the intersection between those two and helping people like myself navigate that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So what I think is, these GRESB and the Morningstar Sustainalytics, they're really tools for investors. I think that tenants can use them, but if you think about it, right, they're at the firm level. And so they're rating the management and policies and procedures and performance at a fund level. So a company like Boston Properties, right, has, dozens and dozens of properties across the country. If a tenant's coming in and looking at one particular building, it's nice to know that they have a sustainability policy, but does that impact that building that they're looking at? It's not always completely clear. And so I think it's great to hear that tenants are asking, does this company or landlord report on ESG? And I think that, what we're seeing is that tenants want to know that their landlords, has their values are aligned. And so, yes, we're an ESG aligned company. We want to rent in a building with a landlord that also has ESG in mind, and we want to know more about it. I think that the ratings, again, you have to kind of really be a technical user of those ratings to kind of understand what you're looking for, right? For GRESB, it's the higher score, as you said, it's the 5 stars, 4 stars that tell you if you're a leader in ESG. But again, really geared at the things that investors are most focused on. And then on the Sustainalytics, of course, like you mentioned, that's a risk rating, and so a lower risk is more positive. But I think when it comes to tenants need to really push landlords to disclose building specific information. And so what that means is, well, it's in a place like DC, the tenant can go right online and look up if what the building's, recent benchmarking report says, whether it's in line with the performance standard for that sector, but really pushing for landlords to disclose as part of the leasing process, what's the Energy Star score? Are you, reporting carbon? We're getting more and more, I'd say over the past, and this has been for, a number of years now, where tenants are saying, hey, we're doing a carbon footprint across our firm. What's the carbon footprint of this building and our at-share percentage of the total building carbon? And so knowing that the landlord is capable of providing that information to them is something that they would want to know, and not something you can just kind of do overnight if you're not already tracking it.
Thank you, Jessica. Does anybody have any other questions? Or does anyone?
There's one more question to bring up. This is for Jessica primarily. But when we were talking about risk and the time horizons for different solutions surrounding mitigation, we're curious how maybe Nuvine's approach those new investments in high risk areas, considering low-lying urban areas and sea level rise, or any of those. Have you decided not to make new investments in those areas, or is there a strategy for those types of situations?
So we have not excluded any areas from our investable universe. So what we've done is we've just identified those high risk areas and put a framework in place where all of, any of our investment teams that are looking at a new acquisition, one of the first things they have to do is kind of go through our climate risk screening process and say, has it been flagged for any of these climate hazards? And if so, then there's a process by which, the portfolio manager is notified, additional IC approvals are required, just so that the discussions are happening very early in the process to make sure everybody's on board with, hey, we've identified this risk. We think it's mitigated through X, Y, and Z. We're going to do X, Y, and Z during the ownership period. And here's what we think the kind of worst case or downside scenario associated with that risk might be. And as long as, everybody still feels like we're getting paid for the risk and that it's a good investment, we are not kind of saying that you can't invest. You just have to be able to really explain why you felt comfortable investing and recognize that it will be part of the ongoing climate risk disclosure. So let's say, one of our multi-family funds buys a building, in coastal Florida, that's going to be in every periodic disclosure that goes to the investor that shows there's exposure in this region. And so again, as long as the portfolio manager and ultimately the investors are comfortable that we've taken, appropriately looked at the risk, then there's no rule that we can't invest.
If anybody else has a question, a last question or two, feel free to enter them in the chat or just unmute yourself. I guess Mandy has a question now. How are your organizations tracking and addressing supplier diversity?
That's an interesting question from a government perspective. One of the things that we think about is what we can control, because as a small city state, I don't know if that's politically correct to say, but as a small state, big city, we look at what it is that we have control over. And so sometimes from a supplier perspective, when we talk about regulations, we think about how we can address people that maybe sell things in DC, because we might not necessarily have people that, or companies that manufacture things in DC, but we're looking at producer responsibility and putting regulations on retailers or people to take responsibility for the things that they put out into the world, as we can control it from a city perspective. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's actually something that I've been pretty focused on over the past 2 years. We do have a DE&I task force or committee within Nuveen Real Estate. I am in charge of the subcommittee on supplier diversity. And we actually have a policy that all of our property managers, when they enter a vendor into Yardi, our accounting system, they have to indicate whether it's a diverse supplier or not, and the certified diversity category that they fall under. And so we are looking to, what we did kind of over the last year is ask everybody to kind of go through and clean up that data. We didn't think that was being kind of fully followed. So we asked everybody to go back, try and clean up any diversity categories for all of the suppliers that they work with. And then we also have a policy that all competitive bids should include at least one diverse supplier, and all things being equal, strive to award that contract to the diverse supplier. But we recognize that sometimes the challenge really is finding qualified suppliers that are willing to bid on a real estate contracts. And so we've found kind of within the industry, there's a lot of barriers to entry for diverse suppliers, things like insurance requirements, or just having kind of had a bad experience and not being competitive and not wanting to participate in bids. And so I think there's a real push across the real estate industry to connect real estate owners and diverse suppliers and try and overcome some of these challenges. Because I really do believe we have a lot of influence within communities in how we award contracts, how we spend money, how we staff our buildings, and the ability to really influence change in our communities through a supplier diversity program. So it's something that we're very focused on. We kind of up the organization. We have a whole team at TIAA committed to supplier diversity. And so when you think about kind of at the parent company level, as a financial services company, a lot of professional services, but within the real estate group, we obviously have a lot more spend with different types of vendors, different services at the building level. So the ability to influence that diverse spend, I think, is greater within our portfolio.
And then I'll add to that, because I feel like I answered the wrong question. I have producer responsibility on the brain. So one of the things that we do when we look at spending money within DC government is looking to do work with minority and women-owned businesses. So we have that requirement from the federal government, and we have to report back to the federal government on grants that they give us. And then we also have what are called CBEs, or certified business enterprises here in DC, to try to support local businesses. And then within our organization here at DOEE, we have our North Stars, and one of our North Stars focuses on equity. And so we have a person within our agency that's specifically dedicated to equity. And so we've been talking about how we're going to set the definition for these things so that we can have shared definitions. We had a training that we required all employees to take. And so we started with racial equity. But then we also talked about our definitions being more inclusive to other types of equity. So for example, gender, people with disabilities, different orientations and things like that. So we look at it a lot from an inclusive perspective and trying to make sure that our spending reflects those goals.
Ladies,
I'm sorry.
We're about out of time, so be respectful of everybody's time, and our panelists especially, for giving us an hour or so of your morning. So we appreciate all the questions from the audience, and this recording will be available like the first series. So thank you again, Kendra and Jessica, and to all of the program committee for organizing this event this morning.
Thank you
Thanks,
for having
everybody.
us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for doing this. We really appreciate your time and effort. And thank you again to the committee for putting this together. Clearly, there's a lot of energy around this. We had everybody who logged in stay the whole time. I know there are questions that are not yet answered, so stay engaged, folks. We have another ESG+R session coming up soon, which we hope to have in person if all the stars align right. So thank you again, Kendra and Jessica. Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.